On August 12, 1570, in the Kremlin Palace in Moscow, Tsar Ivan IV ordered a rival prince to be brought before the court. The prince was accused of conspiring against the Tsar. However, the punishment Ivan decided on was not immediate execution or imprisonment. Instead, the prince was publicly stripped in front of the entire court, including noblewomen. He was then castrated for everyone to see, and the court members mocked him and made lewd comments. Afterward, the prince was forced to walk naked through the streets of Moscow, and eventually he was executed. This punishment, which combined humiliation, physical violence, and public disgrace, became a hallmark of Ivan IV's reign. But he was not the only ruler to use such punishments. Throughout history, several monarchs invented punishments that combined physical pain with personal humiliation, using the bodies and dignity of their victims as tools for political terror. These punishments were not just about inflicting pain or death, they were meant to completely break the victim, using shame and humiliation as a warning so that no one would dare challenge royal authority. These rulers created personal punishments for their enemies, revealing the darkest aspects of absolute power, where cruelty and a desire for total control were clearly evident. Ivan IV ruled Russia from 1547 until his death in 1584. After the death of his first wife Anastasia in 1560, his reign became marked by growing paranoia and extreme cruelty. He established the oprichnina, a state within a state governed by his personal black guard, the oprichnik. These men had absolute authority and carried out atrocities on the Tsar's behalf. Heinrich von Staden, a German mercenary who served as an oprichnik, wrote detailed memoirs about Ivan's methods. According to von Staden, Ivan not only ordered tortures, but often took part in them himself. One of his favorite punishments was public castration, especially for nobles suspected of disloyalty. The victim would be bound either inside the Kremlin or in an open space, and his organs would be cut off while the court watched. Ivan allegedly mocked the victim during the process, asking if they were now loyal or making lewd comments. Sometimes, Russian historians report that Ivan also ordered the wives of executed nobles to be brought to court, where they were publicly stripped and humiliated before being sent to convents or distributed among the oprichniks. In January 1570, during the sack of Novgorod, Tsar Ivan IV ordered the public humiliation of the city's women. This collective punishment was meant to deter Novgorod from supporting Ivan's enemies. The Tsar himself reportedly watched these brutal actions from an elevated platform. Ivan believed that personal humiliation was more effective than mere death for terrorizing the population. He wanted the victims and their families to suffer not only physically but also mentally, by destroying their dignity and family honor through public shame. In this way, he aimed to instill fear in the people, ensuring no one would dare to oppose the empire. During Ivan's reign, he showed extreme cruelty in his public punishments, which often involved both public humiliation and violence. These punishments were not just about inflicting physical pain, but about eradicating a person's sense of self-worth. Additionally, Ivan often took measures to suppress any resistance against the empire, using fear and humiliation as tools of control. Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, the sixth Fatimid Caliph of Egypt, ruled from 996 until 1021. His reign is remembered as one of the most eccentric and cruel periods in Islamic history. Al-Hakim issued many strange and cruel decrees, reflecting his unusual style of governance. One of his most bizarre edicts was the complete prohibition of women leaving their homes. To enforce this, he ordered cobblers to stop making shoes for women. Women found outside their homes were publicly stripped and whipped in the streets of Cairo as a warning, so others would understand the consequences of defying the state's laws. Al-Hakim had an obsession with controlling his people's private behavior. He also banned the production and sale of certain foods he considered to be stimulants. Merchants caught selling these items were publicly castrated in the marketplace. Al-Hakim believed that by removing the reproductive capabilities of these offenders, he was purifying society. In another documented case, Al-Hakim ordered that a man accused of looking at a woman inappropriately be castrated, and then forced him to wear women's clothing and live in the market as a woman for the rest of his life. This punishment not only involved physical mutilation, but also gender humiliation, forcing the victim to live in constant shame. Al-Hakim also punished political adversaries in elaborate ways. When he discovered a conspiracy among some of his viziers, he did not immediately execute them. First, he had them publicly stripped and paraded through the streets of Cairo, mounted backward on donkeys, a humiliating position. Then they were castrated and only then executed. The purpose of this punishment was not just to kill the conspirators, but to destroy their reputation and completely erase their dignity. Al-Hakim mysteriously disappeared during a nocturnal walk in 1021, and it is believed that he was assassinated, possibly by his own sister. His tyranny had become so unbearable that eventually his own people turned on him. Louis XIV of France, known for his political intrigues and nicknamed the Universal Spider, ruled France from 1461 to 1483. His reign, like that of Al-Hakim, was marked by cruelty and political manipulation. Louis was a sharp politician who strengthened royal power, but he was extremely cruel to his enemies. His acts of cruelty are detailed by Philippe de Comines, who was his court historian. Louis had iron cages made for prisoners so small that they could neither stand up straight nor lie down completely. Those from the nobility who betrayed him were kept in these cages for months or even years. Additionally, the punishment included an element of humiliation, as Louis would imprison his enemies in public places, allowing people to mock them. Sometimes the prisoners were kept in only their underwear or were made to stand completely naked. For example, Cardinal Jean Balue, who conspired against Louis, was kept in an iron cage from 1469 to 1480 for 11 years. According to Comines, Balue was publicly humiliated by being exposed naked several times during his punishment. When Louis captured the noble families of his enemies, he sometimes forced their daughters or widows to marry lower-class individuals, such as peasants or merchants, thereby ruining the family's honor through a humiliating marriage. In one case, Louis forced the son of a rebellious duke to marry the royal executioner, a profession despised by the nobility. To legitimize the marriage, the woman was forced to publicly complete the marriage under supervision, adding another layer of humiliation and violation. This method imposed a double punishment. It dishonored the family and unexpectedly elevated the lower-class husbands socially. Next, we see the example of Herod Antipas, who ruled Judea for the Romans from 37 BCE to 4 BCE. He was known for his grand construction projects, including the expansion of the Second Temple, but his reign was also marked by cruelty. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish Roman historian, documented Herod's atrocities in detail. When Herod suspected his wife, Mariamne, of infidelity, he ordered a thorough investigation. Josephus describes that the investigation involved personal and brutal acts of torture to extract confessions. Based on the coerced testimonies, Mariamne was found guilty, and in 29 BCE, her execution was ordered. However, before her death, she was publicly humiliated. Josephus states that Herod forced Mariamne to appear in court, where charges regarding her alleged personal misconduct were read aloud in detail, including humiliating specifics. Herod also punished his political enemies in ways that targeted entire families. When he executed traitors, he often ordered their wives and daughters to be handed over to soldiers before the execution. Josephus recounts an incident in which Herod ordered the entire family of a conspirator to be publicly humiliated, and the punishment was staged as a spectacle in the theater of Jerusalem before their execution. These events reveal that for rulers like Herod and Louis, the pursuit of power was not limited to physical punishment alone. Their politics also involved an element of humiliation and torment that destroyed not only individuals but entire families. The deliberate combination of public violence and intimate humiliation was a strategy carefully crafted by rulers to amplify the impact of their cruelty. Herod wanted the people to witness that defying the king would not only result in death, but also the complete annihilation of family honor and dignity. His goal was to instill such terror in the population that no one would ever dare to challenge his authority. Vlad III, known for his brutal reign over Wallachia, ruled during 3 different periods in the 15th century, with his most notorious rule occurring from 1456 to 1462. While Vlad is primarily remembered for his use of impalement, a form of execution where victims were skewered with stakes piercing their bodies, he also employed this method as a form of deeply personal punishment. The Saxon Chronicles of Transylvania and German pamphlets, published shortly after Vlad's death, describe his frequent use of impalement, especially against women accused of crimes such as adultery or prostitution. These women were often impaled through their private parts, in a manner designed not only to inflict excruciating pain, but also to cause profound humiliation. An account from a German manuscript in 1488 suggests that Vlad ordered the mistress of a rival nobleman to be impaled and displayed naked at the entrance of his castle as a public warning. This combination of forced nudity, sexual violation by the stake, and public exposure created a terrifying spectacle that went far beyond a mere execution. Vlad also devised intricate and gruesome punishments for those accused of treason. When Ottoman ambassadors refused to remove their turbans in his presence, he ordered that their turbans be nailed to their heads. But for those who betrayed him, from his own court, the punishments were far more elaborate. A boy caught committing adultery with the wife of another nobleman was castrated, and his organs were forced into his mouth before being impaled. Vlad personally oversaw these executions, and according to reports, even ate during the proceedings, displaying a chilling indifference that further terrified his subjects. Muhammad bin Tughlaq, who ruled the Delhi Sultanate from 1325 to 1351, is remembered as a brilliant yet unstable ruler. His reign is known for both his reforms and his notorious cruelty. Ibn Battuta, a Moroccan traveller who served at Tughlaq's court for many years, wrote extensively about the Sultan's methods. In his writings, Ibn Battuta describes Tughlaq's harsh punishments, his erratic decisions, and his reformist policies, which elevated the Delhi Sultanate to new heights, but also caused immense suffering for the public. Ibn Battuta, in his travel writings, recorded that Muhammad bin Tughlaq devised exceptionally complex and humiliating punishments for rebels and those who displeased him. One of the most degrading punishments was to make the condemned wear a donkey's hide and parade them through the streets of Delhi, while the public was encouraged to mock and spit at them. For more serious crimes, Tughlaq added punishments of a personal and intimate nature. Ibn Battuta described one incident involving a provincial governor who had rebelled, was captured, and brought to Delhi. Tughlaq ordered that the governor be stripped naked in public, his clothes burned, and then seated backward on a donkey, a posture designed for ultimate disgrace, before being paraded throughout the city so that everyone could witness his humiliation. The physical act of being placed backward on a donkey was not merely awkward, it symbolized the total inversion of dignity. The condemned man's body was exposed, his face turned away from the direction of movement, and his helpless posture became a visual representation of defeat and dishonor. Crowds lined the streets to jeer, shout insults, and throw debris, turning punishment into a theatrical display of royal power. After the humiliating procession, the governor was publicly castrated and then executed. In another account, Ibn Battuta personally witnessed an incident in which Tughlaq suspected one of his courtiers of having an affair with a woman from the royal harem. The courtier was stripped and publicly whipped on his private parts before being executed. The woman herself was stoned to death, but only after being forced to witness her lover's brutal execution. Tughlaq justified such punishments as measures to maintain discipline and morality, though modern historians interpret them as signs of deep paranoia and increasing cruelty in his rule. Henry VIII ruled England from 1509 to 1547. Though widely known for his 6 marriages and his break from Rome, Henry also used marriage as a political weapon and an instrument of punishment. Whenever he desired a married woman at court, he sometimes annulled her marriage by force and then took her as his mistress or wife. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was executed in 1536 under fabricated charges of adultery. Before her execution, she was subjected to a public trial where explicit details of her alleged affairs were read aloud before the entire court, an act designed not only to condemn her, but to publicly degrade her. Similarly, his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, suffered the same fate in 1542. Her trial contained graphic testimony about her private life before and during her marriage to Henry. Chroniclers noted that the explicit nature of the accusations was deliberate, crafted to inflict maximum humiliation rather than seek justice. Henry also imposed strict control over the marriages of his subjects. When Lord Thomas Seymour secretly married Catherine Parr, Henry's widow, without royal consent, the king was enraged. Though he spared Catherine, he created an atmosphere of fear. Everyone understood that defying the crown's authority in matters of marriage could lead to dire consequences. Noblewomen who displeased the king were sometimes forced into degrading marriages with men Henry personally chose to disgrace their families, men who were elderly, poor, or of dubious reputation. Al-Mustansir Billah was an Abbasid caliph who ruled nominally from 1226 to 1242 CE, though real power rested in the hands of the Seljuk sultans. Al-Mustansir maintained strong religious and judicial authority in Baghdad. Contemporary Arab historians write that he enforced Islamic law, particularly regarding crimes related to honor and chastity, with exceptional severity. According to Sharia law, adultery was punishable by stoning, rajam, but Al-Mustansir did not limit this punishment to just the religious aspect. He added layers of humiliation and public disgrace. The criminals were first presented in the Grand Mosque of Baghdad, where they were forced to confess their sins in detail before the public. Not only was their crime acknowledged, but they were also made to describe their shameful actions in explicit detail, emphasizing not repentance but humiliation. After this, they were stripped naked and paraded through the streets of Baghdad for hours, so that the entire city could witness their disgrace. This public display was not about repentance, it was a spectacle of humiliation. The famous historian Ibn al-Athir noted that Al-Mustansir ordered a man accused of sodomy to be not only executed but first publicly castrated, then burned alive. This execution took place in the central square of Baghdad, where the entire population was gathered to witness it. Al-Mustansir claimed these actions were necessary to deter sin and uphold the dignity of Sharia, but in reality, they were brutal. Displays of power disguised under the pretense of religious piety, acts that not only inflicted physical pain, but completely destroyed the victim's dignity, honor, and human dignity. Peter of Castile, known as the Cruel by his enemies and the Just by his supporters, ruled from 1350 to 1369. Medieval Spanish chronicles describe Peter as a vengeful ruler who punished his enemies with humiliating and painful methods. When his half-brother Frederick, known as Master of Santiago, was accused of conspiracy, Peter ordered his execution in 1358. But before the execution, he had Frederick chained and paraded through the streets of Seville, partially stripped, so the public could witness his humiliation. Chronicler Pedro López de Ayala wrote that this spectacle was deliberately turned into a public display designed to ensure the king's power was remembered, while Frederick's disgrace was eternally etched in the minds of the people. Peter also inflicted cruelty upon the families of his political enemies. When he captured the castles of rebellious nobles, he often forced their wives and daughters to serve in his court, or distributed them to his followers as forced wives. This act was not merely revenge, but a calculated political strategy, aimed at trampling the honor of the enemy families and permanently destroying their influence. Forced marriages as war spoils were used to humiliate enemy families, especially by degrading their women. One incident mentioned by Ayala involved Peter forcing a widow from a noble family to marry the executioner who had killed her husband. This punishment was especially cruel, combining grief and humiliation. The woman was coerced into this marriage, under the threat of her children's death, an extreme display of cruelty and insensitivity. Justinian I ruled the Byzantine Empire from 527 to 565 AD, often governing with his wife Theodora. While Justinian is remembered for the codification of Roman laws and military conquests, the court historian Procopius wrote The Secret History, a text not published during Justinian's lifetime that highlighted the darker side of the imperial couple. According to Procopius, Theodora, who had been an actress before becoming empress, was particularly cruel to women she considered rivals or threats. Procopius also accused Theodora of maintaining a private prison where women accused of moral crimes were held and tortured. These prisoners were subjected to humiliations of an intimate nature, intended not only to cause physical pain, but to destroy their dignity as well. However, modern historians question the reliability of Procopius, as The Secret History was written by a political enemy. Official records do confirm that Justinian and Theodora were strict in enforcing moral laws. In 533 AD, Justinian enacted a law prescribing castration as punishment for sodomy, and this law was publicly applied several times in Constantinople, with executions being public spectacles intended to showcase imperial power and moral deterrence. Theodora also established a convent called Metanoia for reformed prostitutes. However, according to some sources, women were forced to enter this convent against their will, effectively making it a prison disguised as a religious institution. These rulers, representing different cultures, religions, and historical periods, share a disturbing common pattern. They all used humiliation and violations of an intimate nature as deliberate tools of political control. These punishments were not random acts of cruelty. They were strategically crafted policies intended to instill fear among the population. The aim of these punishments was not just to physically harm the victims, but to utterly destroy their dignity and honor. Public humiliation, particularly of an intimate nature, was considered more effective than swift execution because it psychologically and socially destroyed the victim long before their physical death. The families of the victims carried the burden of shame for generations. Forced nudity, public castration, degrading marriages, and other forms of abuse are evidence that rulers had complete control over their subjects' bodies and lives. It is important to understand these punishments within their historical context. In many ancient societies, public corporal punishment was the norm, and concepts like privacy and human dignity were not as firmly established as they are today. However, even by the standards of their time, these rulers were considered exceptionally cruel. Contemporary historians often express shock and horror at these punishments. The fact that multiple civilizations independently developed similar forms of intimate punishments suggests something about human nature and the nature of power. When individuals gain absolute power without accountability, there is a tendency to exploit the deepest and most personal vulnerabilities of their victims. The human body and sexuality become battlegrounds where domination is shown most intensely. The victims of these rulers were real people who endured immense suffering. Thousands were mutilated, humiliated, and killed in ways that targeted their most fundamental humanity. Their stories should be remembered, not for sensationalism, but as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power. Modern societies, with the rule of law, separation of powers, and human rights protections, are partly a response to centuries of abuses like these. The study of these extreme cases of tyranny reminds us why limitations on governmental power and the protection of human dignity are essential. No individual should have the authority to inflict such suffering on others. The transition from societies where kings could order castration and public humiliation of their enemies to modern democracies with civil rights was long and complex. This journey is a story of the destruction of countless lives at the hands of tyrannical rulers.